The only key driver of growth, economic growth, has been productivity growth, which itself has come from, from basically productivity shocks. Be it the internet era, be it the outsourcing to China, India, etc., or for instance now the artificial intelligence, it is productivity shocks that have basically driven growth there. In contrast, a country like India, a large part of our economy still continues to be informal. Now, you will view that as a challenge, maybe others will view it as a challenge, but I view that as an opportunity. Today, you pay him basically using Google, GPay or Paytm, and he can use that data to go and get credit from the bank, which was not possible because the bank officer wouldn't have believed, his earnings. Now he has the data to show, and that enables him to actually become part of the formal economy. If you have the mindset that I will look up with envy and I'll look down with condescension, you will not be happy. But if you change that mindset, I will look up for inspiration and I'll look down, with basically gratitude, with the same amount of whatever job, whatever, with just a change in mindset, you will be happy.
Today, as we gather, nearly 50 years from our country's 78th Independence Day, we mark a significant milestone in the continuation of an eternal history. As she soon concludes her 7th decade of independence, India, as a visionary democracy, is bound to gaze beyond to when it stands at 100. Pertaining to this vision, India's global leadership on its 100th independence, we are immensely delighted to be hosting the launch of one of the few far-sighted books that predict the future of the Indian economy. India at 100, Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse, argues compellingly that India is at an inflection point that cannot be ignored. Now I request our author, Professor Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, Professor Shobhit Mathur, Principal Professor Ajay Arora, Vice Principal Hardeep Kaur, and TIC Economics Department, Professor Archie Bhatia, to please come on the stage for the book launch.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, Professor Subramaniam. It is a pleasure to be interviewing him because he was my professor when I was studying at the Indian School of Business. So maybe you can give us a quick overview of the book and the framework that you are using.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank Ramjas College and Delhi University for organizing this book launch. Students in particular need to be listening to this book because you will be the ones who will be making the vision that I've outlined in this book happen, and you will also be the biggest beneficiaries of the vision, translating into reality. So the bottom line prediction I have will seem audacious, but in my opinion is achievable. I'm predicting India to be a $55 trillion economy in 2047 if we can grow at 8%. Let me take you through some of the economic arguments. Of course, I would urge you to read the book in order to get the full sense of how across 27 chapters that cover just about everything that I could think of, in terms of economic policy, what needs to be done so that India can achieve that goal. Let me start with one example. Let's take Japan from 1970 to 1995, the 25-year period when Japan grew dramatically. Japan's GDP in 1970 was $215 billion. By 1995, and I'm sure if I do a sort of a poll here, nobody will guess the number of times its GDP multiplied. I've done this now in enough number of places. Japan's GDP had multiplied about 25 times from 215 billion to $5.1 trillion. We in India, oftentimes do not take or do not track these to draw inspiration from such phenomenal growth episodes. There is a tendency far more to latch on to the negatives and not pay enough attention to the positives that there are and get inspired by positives. And that's why I want to use this example, even the example of China. So GDP multiplied by 25 times from $215 billion to $5.1 trillion. GDP per capita multiplied about 22 times from $2,100 in 1970 to to $44,000 by the time 25 years had passed. And this was a period where Japan benefited from the demographic dividend. Its population grew by about 1% from per annum, from about 100 million to close to 120 odd million. What happened to its currency? And that's an important aspect of my projection as well. The currency, from 350 yen to the dollar, it had appreciated to 85 yen to the dollar. In other words, appreciation of more than 4 times during this period. It is important for us, especially those of you who will think that this goal is audacious, to look at examples like this. Now, of course, those of you who are who still don't want to believe that our GDP can multiply even 10 times, not the 25 times that Japan had, will say, oh, Japan is not, we can't comparable. Any example that I give you, those of you who want to basically not believe or will say, oh, it's not comparable. But I think the way I want to frame this is that I'm not asking that India actually mimic Japan, but we can take inspiration from Japan. It's been my philosophy in life to look up for inspiration and look down to feel grateful. And I think stories like those of Japan are important for us to seek inspiration from. So as I said, the Japanese currency appreciated more than 4 times over the 25-year period. I am not projecting any appreciation of the rupee, but I am projecting lower depreciation of the currency. Here it is important to understand the dynamics of, I am here in Delhi University, so I'm sure, I don't need to get into too much conceptual detail, but the simple fact, and you must have learnt in your international economics classes, that if the rate of inflation, the rate of inflation of the rupee decreases compared to, the past, then the rate of depreciation, nominal depreciation, will also decrease. And by the way, this 55 trillion number is the nominal GDP, not the real GDP, okay, nominal GDP. So do keep in mind that other countries, their nominal GDP also, may increase during this period, and therefore I'm not getting into this business of whether India will be the largest, GDP. We could be the largest if it's some luck. But that is important, because some of the commentary that you will see will confuse the real versus the nominal. This is the nominal GDP. So I'll show you what the calculation is, but let's first understand that if you look at historically India's rate of inflation from 1991 till 2016, and 2016 is a very important year when Indian history is written, Indian economic history is written, when we turn 100. 2016 will be marked as a very important year, because that was the year we implemented the inflation targeting regime. Before 2016, India's inflation had been on average about 7.5%. But in contrast, from 2016 onwards, after the inflation targeting regime has been put in place, which many of you I'm sure will know, requires the central bank to target inflation at 4%, but also provides a room for it to be between 2 to 6%, 4% plus minus 2. As the inflation targeting regime has been put in place, from 2016 to 2024, despite COVID, despite the Ukraine war and the supply side problems that both of these shocks have created, India's inflation has been secularly lower by at least 2.5%, compared to the history. In despite these, and previous episodes were not as much, did not create as much supply side problems, and reduction in supply will actually increase prices. Despite that, India's inflation has been 5% on average from 2016 to 2024. So it's a very reasonable expectation, therefore, to have that going forward as well, India should be able to deliver inflation at 5%. During this period when inflation has been 7% plus, the rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar has been about 3 to 3.5%. But a reduction in inflation will translate into a reduction in the rate of depreciation as well. So a reduction in inflation by more than 2% should translate into a reduction in the rate of depreciation from 3 to 3.5% to less than 1%. And this is not even taking into account any real appreciation of the currency, which I have modeled in the book, but I'm not getting into, for paucity of time. So now let's just go through the economics of this. Assume 8% growth in real terms, and this is in rupee terms. 5% inflation, 8 plus 5 is 13%. So 13% in nominal rupee terms. That's the rate of growth in nominal rupee. But if we have to project in dollar terms, we have to subtract the rate of depreciation, because depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms. Assume the rate of depreciation to be 1%. As I have shown in the book, it will be less than 1%, but let's be conservative and take it 1%. 13 minus 1 is 12%. So, with 8% rate of growth in real terms, 5% inflation, and the rate of depreciation that reflects the lower inflation, dollar growth, actually rate of growth in nominal dollar terms will be 12%. Use the rule of 72, which actually tells you the number of years it takes to double your money. So, 12 times 6 is 72. GDP will double every 6 years. Over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, and I've chosen 2023 so that it gives me the round number 24, doubling every 6 years translates into 4 doublings, because 6 times 4 is 24. India's GDP in 2023 was precisely $3.28 trillion. I'm going to round it off to 3.25 so that I can show you this calculation. 4 doublings then translates into 3.25 to 6.5, that's the first doubling. 6.5 to 13, that's the second doubling. 13 to 26, that's the third doubling. And 26 to 52, which is the fourth doubling. That's close to the 55 trillion number that I've estimated. Let me also show, many of you will find, this multiplication not very easy or find it audacious, because you're not taking into account the power of compounding. As I showed you with the first the example of Japan itself, it is the power of compounding that led to 25x multiplication in their GDP, and of course it was held by the currency appreciation significantly. Now, let me just finally end with, if you look at other predictions, look at an Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young predicts India's GDP to be 26 trillion. Why is it 26 trillion? Again, we can understand that it's the impact of the compounding, but importantly, they assume the rate of depreciation of the rupee to be identical to what has been in the past, which is 3%. So let me quickly show you the calculations. Take 7% real growth, 5% inflation, 7 plus 5 is 12% in nominal rupee terms. Subtract 3% depreciation, 12 minus 3 is 9. 9% in dollar terms basically translates into GDP doubling every 8 years, because 9 times 8 is 72, rule of 72. Doubling of GDP every 8 years translates into 3 times doubling over a 24-year period. So 3.25 to 6.5 to 13 to 26. That explains actually the $26 trillion prediction. So you hopefully are able to see the power of compounding, and how most important element is 8% growth, and across 27 chapters I've actually shown what we need to do on the human capital side, on digital capital side, physical capital side, all the reforms, even aspects of productivity like bureaucracy, judiciary, education, healthcare, all these aspects, that manufacturing, one important aspect, what we need to do to implement policies that can deliver 8% growth. So one more way of just looking at this, if you look at the dollar rate of growth over the last 2 decades, 2-decade period, nominal growth in dollar terms has been 10%, and that has been during a period when the rate of depreciation of the currency has been about 3.5%. Instead of 3.5% depreciation, use 1% depreciation, you go from 10% dollar rate of growth to 12.5%. Again, the numbers work out. Okay. So to summarize, I look at this as India has the potential to be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy. In 1993, when Sachin had played for a few years, played cricket for a few years, Sunil Gavaskar had talked about his enormous potential. It said if Sachin did not score at least 40 international hundreds and at least 12,000 international runs, I'll personally go and strangle him. That was a paternalistic statement about his potential. So this book is basically, I don't claim to be the Sunil Gavaskar of anything, certainly not cricket, nor the economy. But I do look at actually the potential, given the performance, the way Sachin's performance made Sunil Gavaskar talk about his potential. In a similar way, given India's performance, there is the potential. At the same time, the effort that Sachin put in working hard and coming up with creative solutions to headwinds that came about, is as critical for India to take a lesson too. The growth of 8% will not happen automatically. We have to double down on good policies to deliver that 8% growth. If we do that, I have no hesitation in saying that we will be a $55 trillion economy, because fundamentals eventually will show up over a 20-25 year period. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Subbu, for making that very strong argument, particularly the power of compounding that all of us who have a background in economics will appreciate. That's the reason why some predictions stop at 26 and some, like he has made, doubles, right? Just by a few numbers, if you change that, what happens? And a very strong argument for that. I've gone through the book. It is a very rigorous academic argument that he's making there. But naturally, something that comes to our minds is that every country is different. You cannot compare us with China or of Japan of 1970s and how that is going to happen. You have been saying this word potential, just like you mentioned Sachin's example, and India has a potential. So what is that potential that you see in India that is maybe other countries had it or they didn't have it? And what are our unique challenges? Because every country is different. We cannot be extrapolating others' journey and applying it to us. So do you see something there which makes India different from others, and what are those strengths and challenges that we have?
So, Shobit, I think, what I'm saying is that we cannot be mimicking other countries, but we should certainly be learning from other countries' experiences. The fact that other countries are different is oftentimes actually used as an argument for us to have a frog in the well attitude, which is not what I recommend. We should be learning, and the important point is this, other countries that grew, it's not as if they did not encounter challenges. They encountered different challenges. If you look at Japan from the 1970 to 1995 period, this was a period where there was the Vietnam War. This was the period where there was the tremendous oil shock, which led to hyperinflation in the United States. At that time, actually, demand in most other countries was not as strong, and yet Japan grew. So I think, once again, I cannot emphasize this enough. In India, we love to just latch on to negatives. We love running down, and focusing on challenges. I will emphasize that, I like to see an opportunity in a challenge. Others like to see challenge in every opportunity. And I think it is about the way in which we look at. While these may sound like cliches, these are cliches because they work. And that is why the importance of the point of view that we have. This is, it's an opportunity for sure. It's a challenge as well. And let me again use that same example of Sachin. Of course, at the time when Sunil Gavaskar made that prediction, he did not anticipate the tennis elbow injury, nor did he anticipate some of the difficulties during the Greg Chappell era. Those were headwinds. But at the same time, Sunil Gavaskar didn't anticipate the tailwind that came from the quartet that came along. Rahul Dravid, VVS Lakshman, Saurav Ganguly and Sehwag. He didn't anticipate that either. In other words, I think what we have to do is, in a balanced manner, we have to recognize that when you look over a 20-25 year period, while there will be challenges, and I'm not discounting that, but at the same time, there'll be headwinds, but there'll be tailwinds as well. This asymmetric focus only on the challenges is something which is basically brews a lot of negativity. And I fundamentally believe that while positive thinking is necessary for positive outcomes to manifest, negative thinking is sufficient for negative outcomes to manifest. And that is why positivity is really important. With that philosophical, statement, and I think which is really critical, especially for a student audience, if in my 50s I can still continue to be optimistic, you all in your 20s certainly should be optimistic. Let me focus on where are the opportunities. 8% growth. See, one of the things that we do, we basically extrapolate from in incorrect ways from advanced economies. If you look at growth that has happened in the advanced economies, it has happened only from productivity shocks. Why? Because their investment is almost stagnant. They build their bridges, they build their ports, airports, and all of the infrastructure, everything, and the investment they have had to make. So investment is saturated. Also, almost their entire economy has been formalized for a long time. As a result, the only key driver of growth, economic growth, has been productivity growth, which itself has come from basically productivity shocks. Be it the internet era, be it the outsourcing to China, India, etc., or for instance now the artificial intelligence. It is productivity shocks that have basically driven growth there. In contrast, a country like India, a large part of our economy still continues to be informal. Now, you will view that as a challenge, maybe others will view it as a challenge, but I view that as an opportunity, especially given what has happened in the last several years, where significant efforts have been made to encourage formalization in the economy, be it the GST, be it the public digital infrastructure. Those have encouraged formalization significantly. I'm sure you can, students here will agree, 10 years back, if you went to Sarojini Nagar to maybe buy a belt, with the vendor who was basically vending there, didn't even have a shop, you would have paid with cash. Today you pay him basically using Google, GPay or Paytm, and he can use that data to go and get credit from the bank, which was not possible because the bank officer wouldn't have believed his earnings. Now he has the data to show, and that enables him to actually become part of the formal economy. And I can keep giving examples like that. That's the first driver. Second, if you look at even our formal sector firms have not grown, in terms of their productivity. They've not reached the level of the global peers. They are about one quarter to 1/5 of the productivity of global peers. And given the important drivers that, the trends, momentum that is there on two things, innovation and entrepreneurship. Innovation, India actually entered the top 50 countries in innovation for the first time in 2019 after languishing in the, beyond the top hundreds, till 2014, 2015. Now, India is part of the top 40 countries on innovation. Entrepreneurship, if you look at the new firm creation from 2004 to 2014, and this is World Bank data, new firm creation grew at a CAGR of 3.2%. Since then, from 2014 onward, it has grown an orders of magnitude higher. And that also enables us to basically, really bring about productivity improvement. And finally, credit growth. I'm not even getting into the human capital aspects, education, healthcare, judiciary, bureaucracy, which I've covered, but these are really key drivers, and these are lesser, sort of lower hanging fruits that we can pluck. Credit growth, if you look at, the world average for private credit to GDP, in the country, average private credit to basically capture the amount of credit penetration. If you look at advanced economies, many of them are close to 200%. In 1960, the private credit to GDP ratio was 60%. If you look at for India, even in 2020, the ratio of private credit to GDP is 58%. In other words, we are 6 decades behind on credit penetration. This is why I actually require, having a global perspective. If you remain like a frog in the well and keep, on the one hand, say India is different, or on the other hand, basically, don't compare with the globe, then we don't know what are the things that other countries have done. Credit penetration can increase significantly. I'll just give you the example of South Korea. If you look at the private credit to GDP ratio there, in 1960 it was 6% in South Korea. We were at 8% in 1960. From that level, from 6%, South Korea grew to 178%. We've only grown up to 58%. And there is huge potential there. So it is really important, and I cannot emphasize this, especially among students. The whole point of education is so that you learn to think without blinkers, and I think, and not be intellectual sheep. If you basically are believing, and I know whatever I am saying as well, I want you to think critically. Go and read the book fully, look at every piece of data that I've given you, and then decide whether you agree or disagree with me. If you are basically, just because I am saying that it's going to be 55 trillion, you just start believing that without having critically evaluated, you are being intellectual sheep, which is something which actually I can see, whether it's scholar X or Y or Z. If you're just listening, because scholar X said it, I'm going to believe it, you're being intellectual sheep. You're not using the education that education is supposed to make you think independently and not be intellectual sheep. That is what is really critical in order to be able to, if you start believing, look at, use sound economic arguments and data, you will start seeing that there is credibility in what I'm actually talking about here.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Especially, when I see a lot of data being used and very rigorously collected from across the world, the global perspective that you are saying. And you're also saying that each country has its own stories, have their set of, if you look at them as challenges, but you see a lot of upside in India, especially the different sectors that you mentioned, the informal economy, the low credit penetration, and all of them have a huge upside. And that is why you think that the argument that we can grow consistently at 8% for 20 years, you believe that can happen. One question that I had is, across the different chapters, you have also proposed many policy reforms, right? About 20 plus chapters. Each of them comes with a closing lines are about how policies could be reformed to get us to this growth trajectory. If you had an option, what I didn't find in the book, and if you could tell us now, is if you had to somehow prioritize them, right? I mean, there's a bunch of things that you propose, but if you had to choose the top 3 or the top 5 that you think are the most important that should be done, what would those be?
For me, the first thing basically I would focus on is credit creation, because credit is actually the lifeblood of the economy. Think about it. You are an entrepreneur, you started, if you had not gotten financing, all the wonderful ideas that you have, you cannot go and fructify that idea into a proper business. And this is really important. I mean, I'm sure there are many entrepreneurs here as well, budding entrepreneurs, who have ideas. They want to go and, if they're not going to get financing, they cannot go and fructify their ideas. So the runway that we have for credit creation, and that will enable formalization of the economy, it will enable productivity growth as well. So in other words, credit creation is, you can think about as that trigger which can help other two aspects, which is, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's innovation, this is really important. At the same time, I would also, the second aspect I would focus on really is ease of doing business, and here making sure that we understand, especially here in Delhi University, I want to explain, so that you understand some of the nuances. I'm sure, maybe during Q&A we can talk about this. Many times there is this artificial narrative that is created between wealth creation and what is good for citizens. The narrative is that is put is, there are industrial X is growing or industrialist Y is growing, what about common people? Here I want to actually point out, again, I urge you to think carefully about, and that's the whole point of your education. Let me go back to my own, my childhood. I come from a lower middle class family. We used to get, a lady who used to come and, wash dishes for my mother. Some months we would be able to hire her, some months we would not. But even in the months where we were able to hire her, she used to work in nine other houses, doing the same work. In other words, each of us lower middle class family was providing 1/10 of a household help's job. In contrast, the jeweler that we had in our town, in the small town I lived in, he provided about 100 jobs both in his business and and at home. So in other words, in terms of the quantity, that wealth creator, we were not creating much wealth at all as a lower middle class family, but that wealth creator was providing 1,000 times as many jobs as compared to the lower middle class family. Also think about it actually, and this is an exhortation to students here. I'm sure there will be some students who might want to go and work with the government, but a large majority of you will go and work with the private sector. If for instance the industrialists that have started that company, or maybe the shareholders who basically are creating that wealth, if they don't create the companies, where will you get your jobs? So it's really, when you start thinking about, or maybe go about your ideological aspects of saying, wealth creation is contrary to what is good for citizens, I think it is important to start understanding. And by the way, let me tell you, in my 25 years of academic career, I have never gotten even a rupee from any industrialist. Not a single consulting project I've done. So what I'm saying is actually not in the interest of any industrialist, but in the interest of the economy. No industrialist for that matter goes and puts his money or his wealth, he doesn't stack it in pillows or in mattresses and sleeps with it. What does he do? He actually puts it up in companies that provide wealth. And this is an aspect that we need to get over, some of these ideologies that actually are a relic of the socialist past, and start thinking about what is really good for the country. And I think every patriotic Indian really needs to think about these and understand that those demagogues that are actually making you believe that there is this artificial tension, they are demagogues that are actually really exploiting your lack of nuanced understanding on this aspect. And this is really critical to understand. So it's really important that we change that narrative. Respect wealth creators, whether it's a Swiggy, whether it's a Flipkart. All these people have, entrepreneurs have created so many jobs. Think about that person, that person who comes to basically deliver your Swiggy food. If Swiggy was not there, he might have possibly been in a small town, maybe tilling a field, and but compared to that, he's having a better life. Of course, his life can be improved even more, but it is job creation that really provides social and economic inclusion in this country, in anywhere, not only in this country. And therefore, jobs are really critical, and jobs majority are created by the private sector. This is what is really important. Also, the private sector, having worked in the private sector and in the government, I can tell you that's where talent is rewarded. And therefore, it is really critical that some of the narratives that we have here, which are basically our ideological blinkers, we need to remove these ideological blinkers and look at the data, look at the economic arguments, and and thereby look at the world. Because one of the things I'll tell you, having been an engineer, learned natural sciences and the social sciences now, I have no hesitation in saying that in the continuum from science to religion, oftentimes actually, and religion is far more ideological, right? Many times economics, seems to be closer to religion than it is to science. And religion does not, if you want to really help, yourself and others, you need to be far more scientific, and therefore remove the ideological blinkers and think about what is right for you and thereby for the country. So, you asked me about, I'll summarize, it is really important. If I were basically in a position of this is what I would work on, that some of the ideological aspects that students believe in, and therefore basically, end up intellectually hurting, I would do my very best to remove and really explain what is the truth there, and and thereby make sure that people basically are not misled. That would be my first. Second, as I said, on the policy, credit creation, formalization, innovation, entrepreneurship, these are really critical for us to be able to have the growth that we really have the potential of.
Especially, higher education centers like here, where we are forming our opinions of what are the right economic theories,
Yes.
right? And you are saying we have ideological blinkers, we don't look at things in a rational manner or that is backed by data. So you're saying that has to change first, and that has to happen from places like here, and then it will result in policy reforms.
And let me, if you may allow, I hope that some of the students who were leaving because they had to go to the classes. I hope they were not leaving because, what I'm saying does not fit their ideology. If that is the case, I think it's extremely unfortunate, because they're not willing to actually, have their blinkers removed. If they are leaving because they don't want to hear stuff that is, contrary to their ideology, I think, they're letting their learning become a victim of their ideology. That is not why you are in university for. You are in university to learn and to be able to think properly. And that is why it is really critical. More than any other place, let me tell you, I wanted to be here in Delhi University so that I can explain some of these arguments and really tell you the whole point of education is to open your minds. If you continue to have the same ideological blinkers, I have no hesitation in saying, education has not helped you.
And particularly when you say that this thought of the ease of doing business and this appreciating the private sector, appreciating profit making, appreciating job creation, lot of challenges typically come from the bureaucracy as it's seen, that too much of regulation is happening there. Or in the judiciary, when we see that contract enforcement, we are perhaps the worst in the ease of doing business index as well. We are at the bottom of the whole world in that sense, right? So what do you think should be the reforms that should happen within the bureaucracy? Even if we have this thought, many of the graduates from here will end up in those places within the bureaucracy or within the judiciary that can allow this ease of doing business, job creation, private enterprise to flourish.
Yeah.
What do you think should be the changes happening there?
So let me, on the judicial reforms, I've actually put down, the problem of the cases that we have, the case backlog, it's not an insurmountable problem at all. The first step is to ensure that case clearance rate is actually brought to at least 100%. In other words, as many cases that are coming in a year, so many cases are at least being disposed of. That's the first thing. Second actually is to remove the backlog. In order to ensure that case clearance rate is actually 100% or maybe more, the number of judges that is required actually is within the sanctioned strength. It is not an insurmountable problem at all. All we need to do is the judiciary needs to put its head together, work with the, with the governments, especially state governments, to ensure that, because about 90% of this backlog is in the district courts and in the sessions courts, and ensuring that, you know, if the number of sanctioned strength, there is not one, you know, sanctioned judge, you know, that is basically left post that is left vacant. That I think is something, you know, will ensure a case clearance rate of 100%, so that there will be no further accumulation. That's step number one. Step number two is to actually, you know, some of the retired judges who are there, who are actually able, maybe we can create for the next few years, you know, have benches who actually work on just taking care of the backlog, and that can ensure, maybe we can also have overtime. You know, why do we need to have, and we also need to think about the vacations that some of these courts have, to ensure, you know, if we can reduce some of that, the backlog can be reduced as well. It is not an insurmountable problem. In fact, in my opinion, actually it is a very easy problem to solve, because, and I've shown that in the book, provided the, you know, stakeholders actually recognize and show the will to solve this problem. That is all that is. In the case of bureaucracy, and here actually my entire emphasis is on specialization, and I'll use an example to illustrate this. I don't know how many of you, you know, followed this. In 2014, Bill Gates challenged Magnus Carlsen to a chess match. In 2014, I'm sure you must have watched in, you know, in YouTube. It was, you know, set up with a lot of fanfare, and you know what happened? Magnus Carlsen defeated Bill Gates in 80 seconds. Just 80 seconds. Imagine having, you know, let's say two of you sit down for a chess game, and, you know, one of you loses in 80 seconds. Why? What's the learning from here? The learning is that as the world chess champion, Magnus Carlsen is a specialist in chess. For all the ability that Bill Gates has, all the accomplishments he has, he is still a generalist when it comes to chess. This was actually an example of how specialists can eat their lunch, you know, over generalists. And I think this is the important lesson. Let me speculate. If, for instance, Magnus Carlsen had challenged, let's say, Bill Gates to writing a software program, or maybe coming up with a product, I'm sure Bill Gates would have made equal mincemeat of Magnus Carlsen. That example, you know, also illustrates the importance of specialization. In this country, we do not recognize the importance of specialization. We actually think that somebody who's basically ran, let's say, ministries can go and run the BCCI. No, that can't happen. You know, while ability is there, we have to recognize the importance of specialization. And therefore, you know, the extensive set of proposals that I've written down in the bureaucracy is to enable specialization. We cannot have a situation, I mean, just think about it, right? The bureaucrats are also drawn from people like this, right? There'll be some people who will maybe go and work into the bureaucracy, will go into the IAS, IFS, etc., and there'll be others who will go and work in the private sector. So it's not as if that segment is far more brilliant than the other segment who goes and works in the private sector. And yet, what does happen? You know, an IAS officer works in agriculture, and then goes and works in science and technology, and then works in commerce, and then DEA. You know, can it be possible that, you know, the expertise that a doctor has acquired over 30 years, you know, an individual acquires in 3 months, and after having acquired that expertise in 3 months, then goes to commerce, and, you know, all the expertise that industrialists, basically those who do commerce, have acquired over 30 years, this person acquires over 3 months. Not just that, then goes basically to Department of Science and Technology, and then acquires the expertise that a scientist has acquired over 30 years, you know, basically, you know, acquires in 3 months, and then comes to DEA, and, you know, what economists acquire over 30 years acquires in 3 months. No, that's just not possible. And I think this is something we need to recognize, the importance of specialization. I have no hesitation in saying, you know, when I was with the government, I have seen some of the wonderful benefits that some specialists brought. There are a couple of people whom I worked with actually were trained very well in economics. You know, one of them was from IMA, another basically was a PhD in economics, and I was able to see the kind of benefits that came from specialization. But we need to do far more at a widespread level. So bureaucracy is actually, the emphasis needs to be on specialization. Because I worry, maybe when we are actually having these conversations across the table, you know, negotiations, Maybe it is actually a Bill Gates versus Magnus Carlsen, chess match that is happening. And I'm not, I feel nervous about that as an Indian then.
Thank you. Especially on the judiciary, what you mention is problems are solvable, right? It is not that you have to increase the judge strength by too much. It's already within the sanction strength, and particularly the focus on the lower courts. And in the bureaucracy section in the book I have read, and we have compared it globally. It's a solvable problem. People have solved it. We just have to learn from what other countries have done and applied in the Indian context. So it's not something out of the world that we are proposing, and we just the whole narrative that you are saying that these challenges are also opportunities. We don't have to see it in a very negative light. Now, given that you are from academics and I am representing a university and we are in a university setup, right? In the book, I saw a lot of focus on education, particularly schooling, teachers, but the whole youth dividend is here in campuses like this across the country. So what would be your thoughts on higher education, particularly because the demographic dividend is here and they are the ones who would be creating this transformation that you see in the next 25 years to happen. So what about higher education? What do you think should happen in reforms in the higher education itself?
See, Shobit, when I look at, I think on higher education, there is good work that is happening now. I mean, if you look at the number of IITs that have basically, I was there, in IIM Nagpur a couple of days back. Many IIM, lot more AIMS, many IITs. I think that's and there are wonderful universities we have, Delhi University, or Mumbai universities. They're all actually producing very high, and we are increasing the number of, but actually, while you do represent, higher education, for me, the most important focus and the focus needs to be on school education. Higher education, of course, but in terms of prioritization, I think school education is really important. And here, as a teacher myself, that's what my first and foremost role is, that of a teacher. I actually can tell you that, while a good teacher is sufficient for, good teaching outcomes, a good teacher is not necessary for good teaching outcomes. I'll say it one more time. While a good teacher is sufficient for good teaching, a good teacher is not necessary for good teaching. What do I mean? Even somebody who's actually, who's let's say, a normal kind of teacher, not an extraordinary teacher, with very good teaching material, number one. Number two, which is, manuals for pedagogical instruction. The importance of examples, if you saw, for instance, in explaining the potential of the Indian economy, I used the example of Sachin Tendulkar in 1993. The way we all learn, and this is something that I have realized myself first as a student and then as a teacher, we all learn from the concrete to the abstract. What we already know is what we use basically to learn, and that's why all good teachers use examples to basically concretize the idea and then introduce the abstract concept. This is the fundamental aspect of good teaching. So, pedagogical manuals, and I've put in the book this triad, which is the class, the language of instruction, and the subject. For each class, each language, each subject, not only can we have very high quality teaching material, but we can also have pedagogical manuals created, and I've actually put out a full, a method how this can be generated. Because why? I'll give you the example. At Harvard Business School, you would expect that Harvard Business School teachers that come there are phenomenal. They don't need any hand holding. But even at Harvard Business School, what do? The first year is essentially a core. About 12 professors who are teaching the core, they will meet on a Friday to decide how they're going to tackle the case that is going to be done on a Monday. It is about preparation. The example they'll give, how will they basically go about explaining a particular concept, which part of the conceptual part, where do they need to slow down, where do they need to go fast, because when you are teaching, let's say you have a 1 hour class or maybe a 2 hour class, this is a very critical part of a teacher, managing the class, saying this part I need to go fadafat, and this part I need to really slow down because there are nuances involved here. These are all part of the pedagogical, manual, and good teachers actually can lay that out and put that. So, as I said, with good material, and especially using online material as well, YouTube videos, YouTube, now there are basically what you have these reels as well, using all this, Good teaching can be done even by normal teachers. What we need is an effort. Here again, like the judiciary problem of judiciary, this is not insurmountable either. This is something that is easily doable. So part of my focus through this book is to highlight what we really need, because many times when we've not analyzed, the problem seems like a Himalayan one. It is not a Himalayan one. These are all very, very surmountable problems that we all can actually attack and and really solve, and that's the effort.
So recently there was a news that Micron, which will be setting up its plant in Gujarat, we will be like 16,500 crores will be given as subsidies, and there will be around production of 5,000 jobs in that. So per person it's like 3.4 crores. And then
I know where you're quoting the statistic from. Let me answer the question right away. This is about the PLI scheme. Now, in the PLI scheme, the amount that has actually been given out has been actually administered is about 5,500 crores. Okay, there is an allocation, but the amount that has actually been disbursed, and I'm using the PIB data, the government data from the ministry, and parliament questions. 5,500 crores has been given. Do keep in mind that the money that has been given is a one time. What does, and let's look at the data on the actual number of companies that have been created, the number of investment that has come in, and the jobs that have been created. If you just leave everything else, just take Apple. Apple has just through Apple plus its suppliers has created about 1.5 lakh jobs. Okay, 1.5 lakh jobs. Each of those jobs, this is manufacturing. At least that job would be paying 10 lakhs. Okay, 10 lakhs, basically multiply 10 lakhs by 1.5 lakhs, the number of jobs that have been created. Look at the investment that's been provided. Then look at the multiplier that is being generated. So, when you use the correct data and understand the fact that what is being given, what is being invested by the government is one time, but what is being generated in terms of jobs and the salaries is a recurring number, you start seeing that, which is why what I emphasize, rather than just quote what has been written in a book without your own independent thinking of whether it is right or wrong, the simple fact is that wages are recurrent. And the actual money that's been spent is what we should be using, not what is basically being allocated. Tells you, and I'm happy to actually, maybe I can send you a mail with not just Apple's data, but the total amount of jobs and the investment that is created as a result of the PLI scheme. So this is a brilliant example of why we need you all as students. You are here getting education, which means you should not be just parroting data that is, that is quoted by a scholar X or scholar Y. You should be thinking independently whether it is actually correct or what are the aspects. Is it an incomplete? Many times actually the example that is given is an incomplete example. As I said, for instance, the wages that accrue over time. So let's use this example to try and understand that we basically need to have our own independent thinking on this. I'm really glad you brought up this example because I was able to clarify.
Greetings, Prof. I was really lost in the course of the words that you were mentioning all through. We talked about glorifying of the private sector, and while I do agree with the fact that we need a constructive...
I'm not asking about glorifying. Don't put that. That's not the words I'm using. I'm saying respect the private sector.
Respecting the private
Respecting the private sector, because, and about 90% of jobs in any economy, not just India, actually are created by the private sector.
Right.
And jobs are the best form of social and economic inclusion.
All right. Siding with that argument, we have separately dedicated verticals in India, which was not a new concept in the West, but now has been a new concept in our country regarding CSR. So we have specifically dedicated verticals by corporates. While we've not seen much growth as per certain incidents that we have came across, the CSR vertical is not really adding up to the masses of the country as in what it should be dedicated to be supported to. And second thing also, which was also coming to my mind is like your book has really spanned very nicely onto including the numbers, how we'll be reaching that 500 trillion goal in the time being.
Not 500
Sorry,
trillion.
I might have messed with the numbers. I'm so sorry. We'll be reaching that humongous goal by coming years towards the 100th year of our country. How well do you think that also encompasses happiness economics in our country? For example, economics in the new sense is very, very broad. We do not only take the numbers and the money into consideration, but other factors like the health and overall development of human resource.
So let me first answer your question. See, it is important, as I said, when we talk about the empowerment, jobs are by far the most important form of empowerment. Think about, many of you must be in your second, third years, right? Or you must be going for placements. I can tell you that the day when you get your first job will be a day that you will never forget in your life. Why? Because that is so important. It actually, you get your sense of identity from being able to work. That for an individual, jobs mean a lot. I won't forget the day when I got my first job, when I was actually in placements, at IIT Kanpur. And jobs are created by the private sector. So when you talked about CSR, if you push me, I would say the most important quote unquote social activity that private sector does is actually not CSR. That's only 2% of their whatever profits are. The most important job they create is to provide jobs. Because think about it, and I'll give you a personal example. As I come from a very humble background. My father was in the in the non-gazetted grades. He lost his father when he was 7 years old. Through the largesse of an elder sister and an elder brother, he was able to complete school and then got a job in Indian Railways. That was a formal sector job. Okay, do the counterfactual, do the thought experiment. Suppose he had not gotten that Indian Railways job in the formal sector. There is no way he would have been able to educate me and my brother. It was because he was able to educate me and my brother that I am here today, talking about basically and writing this book. If he had not gotten that job, I can speculate, maybe we might have been actually, I don't know, 1/100th of what I've been able to achieve in life. I think this illustrates not just the profound impact that jobs have on a person's life, but not just on the person's life, but generations to come after that. And therefore, when you talk about the most important social responsibility that private sector has, it is basically high quality, good quality jobs. CSR, it is fine that whatever goes in, but that is not the most important. Most important is jobs. And therefore, I will say it again, whenever some demagogue talks about, let's say industrialist X, Y, Z, etc., just ask the simple thing, are they stacking their money, as rupee bills in their pillows or in their mattresses? Answer is no. They're putting that money into work in companies, which is basically what provides jobs to people like you and provided jobs to people like me. If you remember this aspect, I know as you can see, I'm not speaking for any industrialist. I'm speaking for the economy and to ensure that you understand, so that people who basically, those demagogues that will try to pull wool over your eyes do not succeed on this. On your question on happiness, and see, again, you have to be very careful here. Whenever one talks about an index has to be objective. Happiness is subjective. Why? Because you can take a person that's basically, let's say, earning 100 crores a year. Another person that is not even earning, let's say, maybe is earning only 10 lakhs a year. There are orders of magnitude in the amount of wealth they have, right? Will you necessarily say that the person who's earning 100 crores a year is necessarily happy compared to the person who's earning 10 lakhs a year? Can you be sure? No. I can tell you, for instance, without any hesitation, every industrialist who may be earning, more than me, they cannot necessarily claim that they're happier than me. I am very happy because I get to pursue my passion. These are aspects that cannot be captured in a quantitative index. So, an index for happiness is far harder to construct because happiness is very subjective. In some sense, if you have the mindset that I will look up with envy and I'll look down with condescension, you will not be happy. But if you change that mindset, I will look up for inspiration and I'll look down, with basically gratitude, with the same amount of whatever job, whatever, with just a change in mindset, you will be happy. Now, how do I capture basically your mindset? I will have to maybe, sort of put some neurotransmitters to basically capture your mindset. That, economics cannot do. And that is why you have to be careful. Happiness is important, but there are some necessary things, and research in the US shows, for instance, that increase in income till about $65,000-$70,000 per annum, translates into, increase in happiness. But beyond that, it is completely flat. In fact, actually it decreases as well. So in other words, and that's why I think jobs are really critical. When you get a good job, it increases your happiness. It's a jump function, as we say in mathematics. There's a jump in your happiness. But beyond that, it's not necessary. After we have one thing, we want the next thing, right? And if you're always going to continue in life, basically always chasing the next thing, you may not necessarily be happy. And these are aspects that no index can capture.
I just need your comments about two things which we hear about economics debates. First is the K-shaped growth, which India is currently leading, which is a lot of people say that the wealth inequality is getting steeper and steeper with every passing day. And secondly is about environmental acts and the degradation which business or industries actually lead into. And how you think about it, India at 100 would actually be tackling that issue, because any investment cannot control when a flood will come or when a landslide will happen. Nothing can stop them from happening.
Once again, this is another example of, a narrative that is not based on data. Narrative that may actually you look at an anecdote here, you look at an anecdote there, and then you start, it is ideological what you've just said. Why? Because if I look at data and go and read the Brookings article that Sujit Bhalla has written, using the consumption survey of 2022-23 and 2011-12, he's shown that urban inequality as measured using the Gini coefficient and rural inequality, both of them have decreased significantly over the last 10 years. Again, another example, please, you guys are young, your minds are fresh. Don't let junk fill into you just because of your appreciation for a particular ideology. Use data. One of the things I will tell you actually that has benefited enormously, because at your age as well, I did not let any intellectual X, Y or Z lead me like a herd. I actually thought for myself, and even if it was a Nobel laureate who was saying whatever, I would want to evaluate it on my own. Please do not be intellectual, herds here, don't herd. And I think this is an example of a question like that. The earlier example that was provided too, have independent thought. Go and check the data. Inequality, if anything, has actually declined, not gone up. Now, another point, which actually I must read the book. There is a chapter on inequality and growth. If you read a Thomas Piketty and others, they'll basically say inequality has been increasing. Yes, and it's a concern. It is a concern in the advanced economies. I've shown in the chapter here, if you correlate inequality with socio-economic indicators in the West, it translates into a negative correlation. In other words, higher inequality correlates negatively with socio-economic indicators. Do the same thing for India, and I've done that in the book, empirical analysis. There is no correlation. Why? Because our potential to grow at 7% plus and thereby reduce poverty is actually significant. And one of the most important things that people care about is basically to not be poor. So be careful again. I'm sure you'll remember, maybe your dads and moms will tell you, in Bollywood about 20-25 years, there was this phenomenon of basically they would take jingles from Hollywood and just cut paste onto, don't do that with arguments as well, with data. Don't cut paste, with all due respects, don't be Bappi Lahiris actually, in cut pasting stuff, whether it's arguments. There was one question that was just a cut paste from a book. Think for yourself, please. That's the whole point of education. Thank you.